We now learn how to simplify square roots, and we're going to do this with a few examples. So as a first example, let's see how to simplify the square root of 12. Now, one way of doing this is with 3 steps. The first step, I'll just write 1 here, is going to be to write a short list of the first few square numbers. Now, if you're not sure of how to do that, don't worry, we're about to learn right now. So we can start by just writing the first few whole numbers. Those would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So nothing tricky there. And now directly below that list, we're going to write the corresponding square numbers. So 1 squared is 1 times 1, that's just 1. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9. 4 squared is 4 times 4, which is 16. And 5 squared is 5 times 5, which is 25. And we could go further if we needed to. Now, the second step is to find the largest factor of 12 inside this list of square numbers. That's the list written in green there. So we're looking for factors of 12. Well, obviously 1 is a factor of 12 because we can write 12 equals to 1 times 12. But that's not going to help us at all. In fact, that's more or less a trivial result there. So we're just going to ignore the factor of 1 altogether. On the other hand, looking at 4, 4 is also a factor of 12. And we can write 12 equals to 4 times 3. And looking at the other square numbers we have here, 9 isn't a factor of 12, since 12 isn't a multiple of 9. And 16, 25, and so on, well, they are all bigger than 12, so they can't possibly be factors of 12. So the largest factor we find here is 4. And so in this step 2, we can write the square root of 12 is equal to the square root of 4 times 3. And that's our step 2 done. Our third and final step is to use a very important rule. And I'll write this right here. The square root of a times b is equal to the square root of a times the square root of b, where a and b are just 2 numbers. So using that rule, we can now write that the square root of 12 is equal to the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. And now we can simplify. The square root of 4 is 2, and we have that in our list of whole numbers and square numbers. Since 2 squared was 4, the square root of 4 is 2. And so we can go ahead now and just write that this equals to 2 times the square root of 3. And we write our final answer as the square root of 12 is equal to 2 root 3. And we're done. We've just simplified the square root of 12. Let's look at another example. Let's simplify the square root of 45. Now, once again, we're going to start with our list of whole numbers and square numbers, and we're going to follow our 3 steps. So remember, those were step 1, write a short list of the square numbers, the first few square numbers. So we start off in the same way. The whole numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And directly below that, we write the corresponding square numbers. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, and so on. Now, as a step 2, we look for the largest factor we can find of 45 inside our list of square numbers written in green. So looking at this list, obviously, once more, we know that 1 is a factor, but we ignore that completely. 4 is not a factor. On the other hand, 9 is a factor. Indeed, we can write 45 equals to 9 times 5. And we can go ahead and check, but 16 is not a factor, nor is 25, nor is 36. And in fact, 9 is the largest factor we'll find of 45 inside our list of square numbers. So in step 2, we can now write the square root of 45 is equal to the square root of 9 times 5. Now, moving on to step 3, we make use of the important rule. Remember, that was the square root of a times b is equal to the square root of a times the square root of b. And so we can go ahead and state that the square root of 45 is equal to the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. And now we can simplify this. The square root of 9, looking at our lists of numbers here, well, that's 3. And so we can go right ahead and write that this equals to 3 times the square root of 5. And we write our final answer as the square root of 45 equals to 3 root 5. And we're done. We've simplified the square root of 45. Let's look at one last example. Let's simplify the square root of 72. And again, we follow our 3 steps. Step 1, we write a short list of square numbers. And we do that using the whole numbers, which were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And directly below that, we write the corresponding list of square numbers. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 2 times 2, that's 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared is 49, and so on and so forth. Now, our second step, step 2, is to find the largest factor of 72 we can find in this list of square numbers written in green. Now, again, 1 is a factor, but we're just going to ignore that 1 completely. And in fact, there are several factors in this list. 4 is also a factor. Indeed, we can write 72 equals to 4 times 18. 9 is also a factor. Indeed, we can write 72 equals to 9 times 8. But there's a bigger factor. 16 isn't a factor, 25 isn't a factor, but you may have noticed already, 36 is definitely a factor. Indeed, we can write 72 equals to 36 times 2. And that's the largest factor we'll find of 72 inside this list of square numbers. So we can go right ahead now and write that in step 2, we have the square root of 72 equals to the square root of 36 times 2. Now, our third and final step, step 3, we make use of the formula. Remember, that was the square root of a times b equals to the square root of a times the square root of b. And using that, we can now state that the square root of 72 is equal to the square root of 36 times the square root of 2. But now remember, 36 was a square number, and we have the square root of 36 directly above it in our list. The square root of 36 is 6. And so we can write that the square root of 72 equals to 6 times the square root of 2. Finally, we state our final answer as the square root of 72 equals to 6 root 2. And we're done. Now that's how we can simplify square roots using factors which are square numbers. I really hope that helps.